All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the online format of our course, Intercultural Communications. And these are perilous times. What can I say? Not ideal. Certainly in teaching, online is not my go-to, although I have done some of that in the past. In person, that's where the real, I think, learning can take place. But forces beyond our control, we're left to do what we can. So I think what I'll do each week is post some kind of video that just sort of keeps us on track, tells us where we are in the course, what's ahead, expectations for you to do in the week that we have. And you'll notice today is the 23rd of March. We're going to continue, based on the last emails, the discussion of race and communication, intercultural communication. And I posted a number of things on Moodle. By the way, I'm going to be looking to my right and at the camera because I have two computers on right now, just to remind myself what we have. And so right now, this week, there's a reading by Beverly Tatum on defining racism. That's just a short piece to give you a sense of what racism is from the experts. And Tatum certainly is one of those experts. We've been reading her now for a couple of decades. The piece that you have, I think, came out in the late 80s originally. But it's still a very popular piece, and people are using it in courses all over the country. I also posted just a brief PowerPoint. That's easy to follow. It stems from Tatum's work, but it also includes a couple of other things in there, basic concepts. And then also, there are two videos for this week. The first is Tale of Two Schools, which is roughly about 25 minutes documentary that I think will try to put into play for you what systematic racism is. And this is a contentious area, by the way. So racism is hard to define, and you're not going to find agreement, even with people who share worldviews and perspectives. And the argument that I'm going to put forward this week is that racism is systemic. That's how we should be thinking about it. And that's coming from more of a postmodern perspective. And the Tale of Two Schools is an attempt to do just that. So I posted that documentary on Moodle. You can click on it. There are a couple of questions that I asked. I think I posted those questions. I'll follow up if I haven't. Take a look at that video and try to apply what Tatum is talking about to that documentary. The other video gets more into, there's actually two short videos. And again, in class, I would have shown the documentary in its entirety. Unfortunately, the documentary is not available online, so I have to piecemeal what we have available to us, which isn't much, unfortunately. This is a famous documentary that came out in the mid-90s, and you'll see how old it looks by what the characters are wearing in the documentary. But it's a famous piece called The Color of Fear. And what I tried to find, the videos that I found, are kind of the heart and soul of that documentary, where a black man and a white man basically come into a serious disagreement about race. And this is getting to, it has some hermeneutic elements to it, but it clearly will take a more postmodern critical stance for power and oppression or systemic racism is involved. And you'll see where the conversation just goes sideways real quick. And I've asked a number of questions about that. I do remember posting those. Let's see. So you got a couple of things, and just to look forward to the next couple of weeks, we'll do work in class, social class, and gender. Those will be the other two identities. I might do something around religion. I'm teasing with sending you a piece that I wrote that's a hermeneutic analysis of religious identity and conversation that you might find interesting. I got it published, I think a year ago in the Journal for Catholic Higher Education. So that might be something you can look at, where I apply Gadamer and hermeneutics to the question of religious dialogue. So I'm thinking about putting that in there. And then really the course at this point is your main research paper that's posted online, a final exam, which will also be posted online. And then instead of a group project or presentation, you will do an individual presentation. And the assignment is listed in an individual way, where you would post your PowerPoint, or if you use a Prezi, that's fine. You can somehow get that to me, and then your actual presentation. You're going to record yourself. But if you have any trouble with that, please let me know. I don't want to presume that people have all the access to doing these things, and I'll find some alternative ways for you to get that done. Okay, so let me just spend a couple of minutes talking about Tatum's piece on racism. By the way, if my phone rings, just ignore it. Try to have as less distractions as possible in my office. Working from home with teenagers, yeah. So okay. So anyway, let me just give some background with Tatum, and I want to zero in. So her reading is this is the one that's posted on Moodle. Defining Racism. Can We Talk? Yeah, that's what it is. And it comes out of her famous book, Why Are the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Long title. There's also a subtitle to it. And when she wrote this, it just struck a chord. And it was one of the, I wouldn't say the first, but really in the popular literature, popular context, people were, and educators primarily, and Tatum is a trained psychologist, African-American scholar, and has written extensively for the past 20, 30 years on race and racism. This book really hit a chord. And in fact, it's been republished. The second edition came out a couple years ago. So it's worth your read to get a sense of how a psychologist would look at race and racism. But I use this piece just to get a sense of what racism is. What do we mean by racism? And Tatum, I think, does a good job, and this definition is still sticking with us in many ways today, of how, what is racism, how we define it, and then for implications of communication, how we talk to each other or engage in dialogue around issues of race and the barriers that are set up. And in this small piece, it turns out that things like socialization, how we are socialized, which is why, if you recall, well, it feels like forever ago, recall a couple of weeks ago where I asked questions about your own upbringing and regarding race. That's a very Tatum way of sort of approaching this question. So I want to continue that idea, but really get to some of the concepts. And then also just to draw your attention to the PowerPoint that I have. I don't know if you can read this, but I don't know if this is helpful. Again, online, I don't know. This is the PowerPoint. Basic concepts are in there. Okay, real quick, let me just draw your attention to a couple of key ideas in the text. And if you look on page 3, if you have it in front of you, page 3, where Tatum is sort of talking about that this idea of race and racism, it's deep in American social context. It's something that all of us, by virtue of growing up in an American society whose history, again, think back to the macro conception of social identity that we talked about in class, there's really no hope for us in the sense that we can step out of our social context, political, etc., and not think about race. I mean, to be in this society is to be deeply informed by systems of race. And Tatum, as a psychologist, seems interested in this and sort of looking at, preschoolers or high school students, right? So even though they don't have explicit beliefs necessarily about race, let's assume that's true. If you were to dig a little bit deeper with children, we find out that they do have notions of race. And what this reveals for Tatum is that this notion of race that children have and seem to have implicitly is against a background of a system of race, and then what you'll eventually call racism. And but moving on in the piece, let's just start carving out some of the ideas. So on page 4, where she tries to give evidence for this, right? She talks about preschoolers and asks these preschoolers who are what, 3 or 4, something like that, to draw a picture of a Native American. Of course, they're all like, what is that? But the moment she turns that around and says, well, what about an Indian, right? The images start to come forward: tomahawks, feathers, various stereotypical ways of describing an Indian. And as she digs deeper in that, and sort of realizes, or gets us to realize that it's, that the only piece of information where a child gets that is from a Disney film, Peter Pan, for example. And this is, just from an anecdotal point of view, this bears out in my experience quite a bit. But moving on to page 5, just want to draw your attention to the bottom, sort of thinking about this concept of prejudice. And I just want to read for you this, a quick little snippet there in the bottom on page 5. Prejudice, she writes, is a preconceived judgment or opinion, usually based on limited information. I assume that we all have prejudices, not because we want them, but simply because we are so continually exposed to misinformation about others. So then she goes on to describe the tensions that emerge with some of her own students who don't believe they have prejudice. What Tatum wants to say here is that prejudice is something that all people, by virtue of living in this racialized society, all of us, whether we're white, a person of color, it doesn't matter. We are raised and I'll put this in air quotes, taught by our media, our community. This is the meso at play. We're taught we're taught these ideas, preconceived notions about other groups, and we sort of operate and live our lives as if they're true, these preconceived opinions. And we've talked about this already a couple of times. She introduces the notion of cultural racism. So on the top of page 6, this is important to get this definition out. And she simply defines it as cultural images and messages that affirm the assumed superiority of whites and the assumed inferiority of people of color. And she describes it like a smog in the air, okay? That we breathe it in without conscious awareness. The cultural images, stereotypes, essentialisms, reductions of various groups. Without knowing that we're doing this, we just soak them up over and over again. And she wants to say that again, people of color, whites, are doing this. We're caught up in this. This is an inescapable, if you want to use Gadamer's language, horizon of the American experience. And that's one way that I've talked about it before, I think. So, but the real key for Tatum is the way that she describes prejudice and racism. So on page 7, that's where she's going to start making some fairly controversial statements about racism. And I wish we were in interaction, live interaction, because I'd love to get what you think about this. So she wants to distinguish between prejudice and racism. Well, another way of thinking about it we would say something like, racial prejudice or and systematic racism. So this is the definition of racism that she wants, right? So on page 7, she's quoting David Wellman. I don't know who that is. Never read Wellman, actually. Who defines race as a system of advantage, racism. He defines racism as a system of advantage based on race. And this is something that is beyond prejudice. Prejudice is something that each of us has. Okay? We can't escape this, and prejudice goes multiple ways. People of color towards whites, whites towards people of color within various groups towards other people of color, right? And it goes all sorts of different directions, no question about it. But it's at the bottom of 7 where she wants to give a little bit more emphasis to the system of race, where she describes systematic racism as prejudice plus power. What makes systematic racism what it is, a system of advantage, where the dominant racial group, in this case whites, have more benefits, more access to resources, etc., cultural dominance as well. Okay? It's when the prejudice of a particular group is backed by social, political, cultural power. That's what makes systematic racism what it is. Okay? And so and we're getting to the controversial claim. So if you turn to page 8, is where she will begin to challenge this notion of reverse racism. Again, prejudice as racism, certainly all of us are participating in it. But she wants to say that systematic racism is something only reserved for the dominant group, in this case, whites. Okay? So on page 8, she's going to challenge this idea of reverse racism. And see, it's the first full paragraph there. Let's see. Despite the current rhetoric about affirmative action, and she's writing at a time when affirmative action is not as hotly debated as it is today. And reverse racism, every social indicator, she says, from salary to life expectancy, reveals the advantages of being white. And right there, what I want you to do is put it right to, take that statement. I want you to think about this idea of prejudice and systematic racism after having watched A Tale of Two Schools, and try to look at that documentary through the lens of Tatum's argument. And I don't want to spoil anything. I want you to watch the video, but try to make a case. How is the documentary revealing this idea of systemic racism as a way of benefiting whites and not benefiting students of color in these two high schools? Okay, so one of the key implications that follow from Tatum's argument, so on page 9, is this idea, and this is about halfway through the page there, understanding racism, that's the paragraph I'm looking at, is that understanding racism as a system, not a prejudice only. We all have those. Means that notions like meritocracy, this idea that we earn our way in society, she's going to problematize that. And it starts to challenge this idea that as a white person, for example, I've made my way through society. Tatum wants to say that her notion of racism, systematic racism, is challenging this idea that people in the dominant group are, quote, earning their way through life. And I want you to read that piece to sort of chew on that argument a little bit. All right, so on page 10, that's where she's going to make the real challenge with this idea that systematic racism is, to use her words, for whites only. Okay, so here's the key paragraph on page 10, halfway through. Of course, I'm quoting her now, people of any racial group can hold hateful attitudes and behave in racially discriminatory and bigoted ways. And she gives some examples there. But when I am asked, can people of color be racist? I reply, the answer depends on your definition of racism. If one defines racism as racial prejudice, the answer is yes. People of color can and do have racial prejudices. However, if one defines racism as a system of advantage based on race, the answer is no. People of color are not racist in this sense because they do not systematically benefit from racism. And equally important, there is no systemic cultural and institutional support or sanction for the racial bigotry of people of color. Sort of think about that for a moment, right? So, I mean, what would be some of the compelling reasons to support her claim? Right? What would have to be in place, in other words, for people of color to benefit from the system of race that she's arguing whites have benefited from? What would have to be in place for that to happen? And I suppose if you wanted to take the stance of, if you can show that that would happen, then certainly people of color would be racist in Tatum's frame. But she's arguing that that whites are primarily the group to have to have access to the social, economic, and material resources of society that have been that people of color have not had access to. Okay, so keep thinking about that, because that's a challenge, and people in the literature have disagreed with Tatum on this point, and she doesn't have the definitive say on that, but sort of think about what her argument implies. And again, the Tale of Two Schools, or even The Color of Fear, will start to unpack a little bit more of what she's saying. So on page 11, just a couple of key concepts that I want you to pick up. So on page 11, halfway through, she makes a distinction between active racism, that's the blatant, intentional acts of racial bigotry and discrimination on the individual level or the social, political level. There's also passive racism, and this is a more subtle form. She gives some examples: collusion of laughing when a racist joke is told, letting exclusionary hiring practices go unchallenged, et cetera. She offers in a couple of ways. The other term that she offers here, which is being cited more and more even today, is this idea of anti-racism. She calls it active anti-racism. And she offers a metaphor. Think to the airports, and you're on that conveyor belt where you're walking along and you just jump on it and it just kind of takes you. A person who is, so she has a couple of ways of thinking about it. This is the bottom of page 11. I'll just read the quote. I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. You just keep walking. The person engaged in active racist behavior has identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving with it. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway, but you're moving along in the flow of the society. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt just takes you along. Okay. The person who is actively anti-racist is the person who's on that conveyor belt, chooses to turn around and unwilling to go in, to quote her, to the same destination as the white supremacists. Quoting her again, but unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction, imagine how hard that is, right? You're on that conveyor belt and you turn around, you start walking in the opposite direction. Everyone's like, what are you doing? Everyone's, you're a problem now, okay? But an active anti-racist is moving in the opposite direction. Okay. All right, that's Tatum in a nutshell. Again, in class, there could have been a lot more discussion, would have broken you up to sort of think about these concepts. Again, Tatum's not the definitive word, but I think she offers us a really interesting way of thinking about what racism is on the structural level and distinguishing it from prejudice. Okay, that's the video for this week. Next week, I'll do some more videos and try to find some other documentaries, readings. We're going to try our best to make this work. If you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to email me. We can certainly have exchanges via email. Phone, I can do phone. You can call my work line. That's all on the syllabus. I hope everyone is staying safe, social distancing practices, and not going, you know, out of your minds at home. So hopefully you can stay engaged, and I hope to see you soon too as well. So anyway, look for new videos coming up soon. Thank you and take care.